On September the 18th, 1976, the people of China went into mourning. Mao Zedong had died. For 25 years he'd ruled 1/4 of the world's population. No other leader in modern history has held such power over so many people for so long. Chinese state television broadcast his funeral.
Although trying to restrain their bitter grief, they weep as they slowly file past to pay their respects to their most respected and beloved leader, Chairman Mao.
Who was this man who inspired such awe and devotion? Mao's story takes us back to the early years of the century. Mao grew up in a country hardly altered since the Great Wall was built in the 16th century. For 2,000 years, China had been ruled by emperors. Most of the population worked on the land as serfs.
The conditions which most Chinese lived in at this time were what we would regard as unbelievably terrible. I mean, really appalling conditions. Most Chinese lived in hovels, in houses that were built of straw and mud. They were often hungry. They were subject to exploitation from a very powerful landlord class.
By the time Mao was born on his father's farm in 1893, the country was desperate for change. In 1911, the emperor, a 6-year-old boy, was thrown out and replaced by a Republican government. Civil war erupted as local warlords raised private armies and fought for control of the country. China was thrown into turmoil. When he was 18, Mao moved to the relative calm of the capital, Beijing. Here he discovered the books of Marx and Lenin, and in 1921 became a founding member of the Chinese Communist Party. But support was slow in coming, and when the Chinese authorities turned on them and launched a campaign of murder and torture, the communists were forced to flee the towns and go into hiding. They settled in a remote hilly region south of the Yangtze River and set up a series of liberated zones, or Soviets as they called them, under communist control. They preached justice to the peasants, promised a fairer society in the future, and provided military training so they could defend themselves. Wealthy landowners were kicked off their land and the peasants encouraged to humiliate them publicly. As the communist zone spread, the Chinese government, now run by a fiercely anti-communist president called Chiang Kai-shek, sent troops to restore control. The communists were outnumbered and outgunned. By 1934, they faced defeat. As government soldiers closed in, the communist leaders argued over what to do. Mao counseled retreat. As the fighting grew more intense, he won support for what became one of the greatest strategic retreats in military history. From Jiangxi, the communists set out on an epic 6,000-mile trek to the remote mountain city of Yan'an in the north. It was to become known as the Long March. It took over a year. There were running battles with government troops all along the route. 100,000 people set out. An estimated 70,000 died on the way, many from hunger and exhaustion. Yet the ragged army survived. It was a triumph of sheer determination and made Mao, who'd inspired it from the beginning, the unquestioned leader of the Communist Party. Future generations would learn about it.
When we went to school, we were taught about the 6,000-mile march of our revolutionary ancestors and how they spilled their blood so we could have a decent life. To make us appreciate it, our teachers taught us that all victories were due to the leadership of Chairman Mao.
In the isolated city of Yan'an, the communists regrouped and launched a guerrilla war against the government, which was to last on and off for the next 14 years. Millions died in a war of extraordinary brutality.
I can still remember very vividly the stink, the terrible stink of dead bodies, which were laid somewhere. I didn't dare to find out. It was a few days after the liberation of Shanghai. So I could imagine that in the previous battles, when 500,000 soldiers could be swept away in one battle, the bloodshed must be terrible.
Slowly, the communists took control of city after city. Mao's Red Army had won, and in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek fled the country. Later that year, Mao made a ceremonial entry into Beijing. At a huge rally, he announced the new Communist Republic. Mao became the first president. His power and popularity were now unrivaled. He was to become a god in the eyes of many Chinese people. The early months of revolutionary excitement soon gave way to the realization that China needed to drag itself into the 20th century. Mao urged it on, impatient to modernize as fast as possible. Industry grew rapidly as millions of peasants were encouraged and sometimes forced to leave the land and work in the new factories. Farming began to fall behind, and before long, China was struggling to produce enough food. There was hunger in some regions. The economy was slipping dangerously out of balance. The communist leadership argued about what to do. Mao insisted the country should continue to push ahead as fast as possible. His fellow leaders disagreed and warned of problems. Mao, determined to get his way, took the issue to the country, asking the people to join him in a giant experiment in modernization.
现在也面临着后数年监管初期大体相同的一路，要把一个落后的农业的监管改变成为一个先进的工业化的监管。
They gave Mao their overwhelming support. He called it the Great Leap Forward.
He liked the idea of the economy and the society making suddenly an enormous leap, and he likened the economy to a wave gathering itself, as it were, and then crashing forward. That was the idea of the Great Leap Forward.
China was caught up in a wave of enthusiasm. It became a country of amateur iron and steel makers.
The sports ground of our middle school was turned into a field of many furnaces, and we were very enthusiastic. We burned almost everything that can be burned, and we melted everything that is iron or any metal. We dismantled all the steel doors, all the iron doorknobs, and everything iron was thrown into the furnace.
Reports came in suggesting steel production was reaching extraordinary levels. Then slowly the truth seeped out. The figures were false, and the steel was so badly made it was useless. But such was the mixture of fear and faith in Mao that nobody dared admit it or to tell him. Much more seriously, farming had collapsed, as yet more peasants deserted the land to work in factories. Hunger and then famine spread across China. It's now thought up to 30 million people may have died of starvation as a result of Mao's experiment in crash industrialization. Mao had made a gigantic mistake, but the truth was quietly buried. Nobody dared criticize the man who was the father of their revolution. The famine was blamed on bad harvests, and Mao temporarily took a back seat while he plotted his next move and watched what his rivals would make of the situation. He wasn't to return to public life for several years. In 1966, Mao took a well-publicized swim in the Yangtze River. It was his way of saying, "Look, I'm back." The country was still recovering from famine, and small-scale private farming had been introduced to get food production back on course. The country was gradually coming back to life. But Mao violently objected to the return to private enterprise. And behind the facade of unity, there was a bitter power struggle. He accused his fellow leaders of selling out the communist ideals of the revolution. Fearful of another famine, they ignored him. Mao once again took his case to the people. He summoned China's youth to Beijing and told them to launch a cultural revolution which would return the country to communist basics. He urged them to root out any ideas which conflicted with his particular view of communism. Millions of young people brought up to worship Mao gave him their unquestioning support. Hong Ying, born just before the Cultural Revolution, was one of them.
The first sentence I learned was "Long live Chairman Mao." We used to pray to him day and night. He was constantly in our hearts. We sang about him, we danced about him, we worshipped him. Without him, we wouldn't have existed.
A little red book of Mao's political thoughts became the People's Bible. The country was gripped by an extraordinary revolutionary fervour. Mao's position was stronger than ever. An army of school children and students, Red Guards as they became known, took Mao's message of a return to communist basics to the country. Normal life came to a standstill. Schools and universities were closed and teachers humiliated and beaten up. People suspected of harboring anti-revolutionary feelings were ridiculed, imprisoned and sometimes killed. Thousands were forced to admit to imaginary crimes. The country descended into anarchy. Nobody from top Communist Party officials to lowly factory managers felt safe.
Some people were sent to special seminars in order to study Mao's thoughts. Some committed suicide by throwing themselves into the river. The Cultural Revolution became utterly horrendous, and the horror had a color. It was red. It was terrifying. I will never forget it. My worst nightmares were full of the color red.
By the late 1960s, even Mao realized his youthful army had got out of hand. At least 1 million people had been purged, tortured or executed. Mao ordered a halt. But by now he was an old man and his health was fading. In 1976, he died at the age of 83.
Mao used to be like a god to me. Now he's like a ghost. When I went to Beijing for the first time in 1986, I saw him in his mausoleum, and I realized he wasn't anything special. Even he died in the end. That was Mao Zedong.
In China today, Mao is still a hero. But as we learn more about the human cost of the revolution, history may be a harsher critic.